You want me to go that far back?
No. Okay.
Can everybody see the slide that's up?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So, I and some colleagues down at the Fort Collins Science Center submitted a proposal to the North Central Climate Science Center to help to push the process that we started last year down the road a little bit more and get a little bit more specific, under the aegis that we would come away at some point with some understanding of how climate uncertainties fit into the management context that the different partners within the LCC are working in. And so the idea was that by going through this process, we'd be helping ourselves and helping our partnership down the road, and then we could carve out this piece of it that had to do with climate information and use that to start this dialogue that the Climate Science Center is trying to start with us. And so in order to push this down the road and try to get more specific about the kinds of uncertainties and the kinds of decisions that we're thinking about wanting to support in this partnership, we decided after long discussions on the phone with members of the technical committee that we needed to get more specific about the kinds of management problems that the partners were facing. The idea was that in the last workshop that we had, we came away with something that was a bit too general. So we had a series of conference calls, and the management problem that came up over and over again was invasive species management. It may not be the most pressing issue for any one of our agencies or partner or organizations. But it was one that at some level all the partners that at least that were on those technical committee calls had to deal with. So we went through a process to try to articulate some sort of a problem that we could work on in this workshop that we held on September 11th. And I'm kind of paraphrasing this, but the management problem that we sort of came up with was how do we optimally choose from different management strategies to try to control invasive species? And we were talking about invasive species fairly broadly. We were talking about terrestrial and aquatic species, plants and animals, and we were talking about trying to boil this down to something that was more site-specific, perhaps more species-specific, and even potentially looking at a single time slice. And the idea, at least initially, was that we were probably going to focus on terrestrial species and then maybe deal with aquatic species if we had time. So we had 9 people show up to the workshop in Bismarck, and I actually feel kind of silly now that I didn't include a slide with the folks who participated. But we had folks from the state of Montana, Minnesota, other USGS representation besides me. We had folks from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, and of course Rick and Mike were there as well. And we sat down and started to try to work on this problem, and the folks who were in the room started to suggest that maybe that wasn't really the level of decision making that we felt comfortable informing or working with, because the folks in the room, most of the folks in the room, not everybody, but most of the folks in the room didn't really deal with sort of field level selection of strategies to manage invasive species, but instead felt like, at least at the level they were thinking, that the kinds of decisions that they were thinking about supporting were more strategic decisions about how you invest in programs to control multiple species across a landscape that you're tasked with managing. And so the idea then was that maybe what we should do is focus on this strategic management problem using multiple plant species, and in particular terrestrial plant species, as an example of how we could use a process like this to figure out what the uncertainties are surrounding this management problem. And again, when we talk about the spatial scale of this, we kind of hedged a little bit and talked about an aggregation of sites. Now, we didn't really put a spatial or a unit on what we meant by aggregation or what we meant by site, but just to kind of represent the fact that we were thinking about multiple sites in some sort of a landscape context. Now I'm not advancing, okay. And so after that, we went through a process of talking about what the management objectives were behind, say, investing in these control programs. And at first, we, as a group, decided that it's really about trying to maximize the number of native species. The idea being that if you have invasive species in an area, that means that they're taking up habitat that a native species could be occupying. But then we started to dig into that a little bit more, and there's still some debate. I was hoping that, I think actually Marissa's on the phone, and maybe later on Marissa might chime in a little bit about this discussion, but we had some debate over whether or not what we're really trying to do at this scale is minimize negative impacts from invasive species or maximize potential native species habitat, if those would perhaps be better objectives. Now, for those of you who've not been through this process before, the idea is that these objectives have to be measurable somehow, and they have to be the end point, so they're not a means of getting to someplace else. So we, when we send out the workshop summary, we'll have a lot more detailed description of what that discussion was really all about. The other issue that came up was that really there's a public perception aspect to this management problem, in the sense that if you engage in a particular strategy, you want the public to feel like you're doing something to try to control invasive plants. And at least for a number of the state folks, they had suggested that a way to measure this public satisfaction objective is through the number of complaints that are received at the office. That's one of the primary indices that they use to determine whether or not they're actually investing in strategies that are effective, or if the public is at least perceiving that the management is actually doing something. And then, of course, the last objective there, minimizing costs. The idea is that you want to basically invest in efficient programs, so programs that are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. So then we started to talk about the different kinds of actions that could be taken to try to meet those objectives. What we started doing was talking about actually suites of actions, which we called strategies. And we sort of grouped those into two main categories, one being a control strategy, which you could further break down into control of existing infestations versus new infestations. You could target the most aggressive species or the least aggressive species. You could also try to incentivize landowners to help with some of that control. The other set of strategies had to do with prevention. So do you invest in strategies that reduce the risk of new infestation, so you control vectors or dispersal pathways, or invest in public outreach as a subset of that. So do you try to get people to, say, not move firewood around and things like that? And initially we started talking about it as sort of an either or. So do you invest in control or do you invest in prevention? But then we started talking more about how, in reality, these are probably more mixed strategies. So you might do a little bit of control and a little bit of prevention. And some of those strategies are going to be more effective than others. And then, of course, you could not do anything at all, which in many cases isn't really feasible, but we put it in there just so we could try to figure out what the what the impact of not doing anything might be, say, on a simulated management system. And so we took all of that and we started doing what we're calling here conceptual modeling. So this is where we start to identify what the uncertainties are, what the science needs are. So on the left, in blue, there are the decisions that can be made or the strategies to be implemented. And then over on the right, in the orange polygons, are the objectives. Now, of course, we didn't finish the conceptual part of this, and that's something that my collaborators and I are going to continue to work on, and we might actually ask you guys in the technical committee to continue to participate along the way as we start to build in more of these links. But the idea is that all these other polygons here are uncertain processes or uncertain states of nature that impact your ability to predict how effective a particular management strategy is going to be on meeting a particular objective. So down the road, the idea behind this project is that we go through the process of quantifying these yellow polygons or these tan polygons with actual models. And then we do an analysis called a value of information analysis. And what that does is basically says, if you could resolve an uncertainty here, does that affect what decision you would decide is optimal under those circumstances? And the idea is that those decisions that are really sensitive to certain kinds of, the kinds of information that make the decisions sensitive are priority pieces of information. And those are the things that we might want to prioritize in terms of science plans. So it's actually very similar to what we did last year, but in this case we're trying to be a lot more specific, and we're trying to actually make the links from specific kinds of decisions that can be made to those objectives. What's next? Well, in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to be sending out the workshop summary. Hopefully we can get a draft out before then, but I didn't want to promise too soon and have us not be able to meet that deadline because we're all fairly busy. But in the meantime, we're also going to be finishing up that conceptual model and beginning the quantification process, and then doing that value of information analysis. And hopefully by the time we've gotten that done, we'll have a more fully developed report on what we found in that analysis that were the priority information areas. So with that, I guess I'd open it up to any questions. I'm sure that there's probably a lot of confusion for folks that weren't actually at the workshop.
Maybe a place to start here, Max. Rick, would you like to weigh in and talk about how this effort relates to the discussions with the tech team the last couple of gatherings and where we're headed?
Sure. You want to?
Yeah, we can send it.
I've got the slides up now, but I gotta.
Oh, I'll pass. My bad. I'll pass power to you.
And as a reminder to folks, as Max said early on, that this was one of 4 Climate Science Center projects that were funded in the last year. We've heard from Rick Soja on a call about a month ago and his sage grouse project, and we're about to hear from Amy here in a few minutes. But Max's project, obviously, assisting with the LCC as we specify some of our science needs, and where the climate links are is certainly one that we're working with very closely. So go ahead, Rick. It looks like you've got your slide up there.
Okay, so again, this will be a little redundant with some of the things Max covered, but the slide you see now are the 5 science needs that we used in our RFP last year, and those are kind of just the bullets. We had more information in each one of those, if you recall, from the RFP. But those are the 5 science needs that we used that came out of our decision analysis workshop, the first one we did. And when we went to the steering committee, as you recall, they said, well, whittle that list down to 5 for the RFP, which we did. So those 5 are the ones you see. And of course, the process we used was a great improvement over what we'd done the previous few times. And so we're undergoing the continual improvement that we always strive for in terms of refining these science needs. So that's the ones that we used the last time. The process that we're proposing to use this year, that will build on what Max has done for us a little bit, follows kind of this schedule. And remember, of course, that the federal government is under a continuing resolution, and there's a whole host of things going on that are going to impact the ability of the Fish and Wildlife Service to put what I'll call our seed money into it. We've been putting about $1 million of seed money into these research projects. We started, of course, with all of the funding being Fish and Wildlife Service funding. And the last round of proposals, we actually had almost 3-to-1 either cost sharing or matching money coming in to match that Fish and Wildlife Service $1 million. So what we want to try to do in a nutshell is put this process together for a couple of reasons, to benefit us internally and also to benefit folks that are going to actually get funded through this process. So we met in September, did the workshop. Max just went through this. Where we are now is the 3 of us are working on reporting out to you all, and we'll send emails out to the folks at the whole tech team that weren't able to make this call so everybody's on the same page. We're going to then talk to the steering committee about recommendations that are going to come from the tech team on how we ought to use the information that Max has garnered. So I'll just say that one of the things that came out of our meeting, and Max kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I'll dig into it a little more deeply, is we were going to use this as an example. The invasive species climate change thing was going to be an example process that we walked through to help us more clearly focus on one thing. For those of you that were at the workshop, remember we kind of got off on a lot of different tracks, which is how we came up with 27. But I think by the end of the workshop, folks at the workshop were in agreement that this was a really powerful process, and perhaps we should make a recommendation to the steering committee that a part of our process this year really does focus on invasive species and using the information out of the workshop to really hone in on invasive species, as well as other things that we've identified as science needs. But because we've gone through this really intense process and come up with a really good list of uncertainties, that we might focus on that. So that's probably going to be one of the things we would say we should recommend to the steering committee. But we also have to run, some of the other things by them. Do they want to use the same list as last year? Do we want to do something different? So that's what we're planning on talking with them about here shortly.
The other thing, Rick, I'd remind folks, I think it was a month ago or 6 weeks ago when we were trying to dive down into the topic for the workshop. The other thing that came up again and again is regarding the LCC focusing on issues that relate to land use change across the geography. And obviously one of the aspects of land use change could be invasive species, but there are certainly many others.
Yeah, good point. Thanks for bringing that up, Mike. So our October is going to be spent on a couple of things. So Mike and I and the tech and the rest of the folks in the tech committee are going to take this prioritized list of science needs and the targeted priorities that we may come out of with what we've done at the workshop, and then develop the RFP. So Mike is already working on writing up the language in the RFP, and we'll fill in some of this stuff later. You'll see a phrase in there that says our sole source is justification. So because the service is putting seed money into this, we're going to have to follow normal federal government procedures, which will probably require us to do some type of an RFP through grants.gov. But the other option for us would be, and this is the future vision perhaps for this LCC, but we have a pretty good group of folks sitting around the table, and my view, I guess, or my vision would be that at some point we ask ourselves who can do this work, who's got the capability, and who would be willing to participate in either providing funding or staff or data or something, so that's what I'd call a sole source justification. So we might say to the Nature Conservancy, you've got the capability to work on this, would you be willing to take this on if we can provide resources? So that's an option for us as well, depending upon where we go. We're also going to spend some time this month getting out the review criteria and ranking criteria we used last year. We'll revise those. We'll make sure that they fit for what we're doing, and then we'll make that information available as part of the RFP. We heard that message loud and clear originally, that people want to know how they're going to be ranked. And then we'll get this solicitation package ready to go out the door at the end of October. November, we're going to give everybody a month to submit a proposal. We've run the gamut of several weeks to a month, and we think a month is reasonable, but that's open for discussion as well if the tech team thinks it's too long or not long enough. But the real change for us this year will be we're going to give all of you on the tech team a couple of months to do this reviewing. We also heard loud and clear that 3 weeks or so isn't enough to pile through 75 or 80 proposals, and we absolutely agree with that idea. So we're going to do a 2-month review. That'll give us plenty of time to rank, review them, and then make recommendations to the steering committee that they will then take up at their meeting, which is probably, going to be in February. They're planning to meet now, I think, in conjunction with the North American. I think that's in February. At that point, they'll take the recommendations from the tech committee, pick the projects that they want to move forward with, and then we'll notify PIs. And then in March, we'll get the funding instruments in place and the funds dispersed. And that's also a direct response to the fact that over the course of the last few years, we've been out of sync with the federal budget process and the contracting rules that we have to follow. And we've gotten money to folks, late in the summer or even the end of our federal fiscal year, which becomes an internal problem for us if it's service money that we're getting out, just in terms of the contracting rules. So that's our proposed solicitation process for FY13.
So, I guess for the next 5-10 minutes or so, are there questions for Max, Rick, or myself on the workshop? How we're going to use some of the results of the workshop in the next year's request for identification of uncertainties that we may explore, or anything about the process for how we get from today to the cutting of the contracts for the next year's funding cycle. Well, Max, you did pretty good for being under the weather, I guess.
Thank you.
Rick, do you still have control then of the webinar?
I do. How do I give it back?
Let's see. I think I can do it from here, maybe. We have to go under the participants. Let's see. I think Amy, it should be coming up on your screen now. If you click on Share My Desktop.
Okay. You see my screen?
I do.
All right.
Go ahead, Amy, and introduce yourself, where you work, and your PIs on the project. I'm sure that they'd appreciate that too.
Okay. Forgive me, I'm a little under the weather too, so you'll have breaks for cough. So my name is Amy Symstad. I'm a research ecologist with the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center, same place that Max is from, but I am stationed at Wind Cave National Park in southwestern South Dakota, and a lot of my work has focused on management issues for the Park Service. My two collaborators on this project are Dominique Bachelet and David King. They're both out in Corvallis, Oregon, associated with a group of climate change researchers out there. And so I'm going to hopefully give you a pretty brief run through of what this project is all about, so that at the end I'll have a little time for your input. I'll start with a brief review of our results from a previous project that we worked on to give you an idea of the background and some of the things that we're hoping to do with this project, and then go into the goals for this NGP, meaning Northern Great Plains Project, and end up with a couple of slides where describing the type of input that I hope to garner from you all. So the previous project that I mentioned is a project funded by the National Park Service to try to quantify expected changes in primarily vegetation at Wing Cave National Park in response to climate change. The approach that we used in this project was to use MC1, which is a dynamic vegetation model. And this model takes monthly climate data from either the past or the future in terms of just precipitation, minimum and maximum temperatures, and relative humidity, and uses that data to inform 3 different interacting modules of the model. The first module basically uses threshold values of precipitation, productivity, and a variety of other things to describe the type of vegetation that's available. And when I say type, it's in fairly growth form categories, such as evergreen, needle-leaf tree, or C3 grass. This module interacts with basically a biogeochemistry module that simulates carbon sequestration in the soil, for example, plant production, and other ecosystem processes like nutrient cycling. Both of these interact with the dynamic wildfire module that basically modifies these 2 other modules based on episodic fire that occurs with respect or in response to the buildup of fuels. It has characterizes the fire based on what type of vegetation is there, and takes into account the climate information, or dryness, basically, of the fuels. In this project, we used 3 different climate scenarios from global climate models, and the 3 climate scenarios are here over on the left, with the CSIRO basically being a relatively wet model for especially this region, the MIROC model being fairly dry with precipitation decreasing somewhat through time, and the Hadley model being basically intermediate with precipitation staying pretty much the same for this region through the next century. And all of them have increasing temperatures, but the CSIRO is the coolest, and MIROC the hottest, and Hadley the intermediate. And those 3 models weren't necessarily chosen, the climate models weren't necessarily chosen because they're the best fit for a specific region, but to bracket the range of global climate model output that in terms of the overall patterns that have been seen so far. So I know a lot of managers don't really put a lot of stock, and climate modelers for that matter don't put a lot of stock in a specific climate projection, but they want to get an idea of how their system might react under different climate scenarios. So here, I'm just going to present a few results from this project to basically give you an idea of the patterns that we're seeing for this very small area in the southwestern part of South Dakota, and the types of output variables from the model, so that you can get an idea of what maybe you would be interested in seeing for a larger region. At Wind Cave, we ran the model in a couple of different situations. One under natural conditions where basically managers aren't interfering with fire, and there's a moderate level of grazing, 30% removal of above ground productivity every year. And the results from those simulations show that when fire is left to its own devices, the fire frequency increases pretty substantially from historical time periods, and this prevents the expansion of the forest into the grassland, which I should have mentioned. Wind Cave is at a prairie forest border area. This model also simulates an increase in the ratio of C4 or warm season grasses to C3 or cool season grasses because of warmer temperatures. C4s generally do better with warmer temperatures. It also simulated basically increased water use efficiency of a variety of plants, and that increased water use efficiency mitigates some of the drying effects that any type of warming will have on the system. And I think probably most outstanding from a management perspective is this, at least in the two warmer, drier scenarios, a pretty substantial shift of production. This mean monthly grass leaf area index is kind of a measure of production at a certain time step. And that shifts from a relatively flat cover of grasses throughout the growing season in the historical time period, having a much more of a peak early on, and then that cover of grass is decreasing throughout the growing season. And that could have pretty serious ramifications if you're trying to maintain a certain size of a bison herd in a fixed geographical area like you would at a national park. Then we ran the simulations with a few different management scenarios. One of them looking at the grazing pressure in response to that possibility that they might have to have more animals than the system might be able to handle well. So we wanted to look at if you're constantly have constant heavy grazing, will that impact the productivity of the grasses, which is what's basically shown in these graphs. And yes, of course, that will happen there over time. But that's regardless of which model that or which climate scenario you're looking at. One thing that's somewhat encouraging, though, is in the intermediate climate scenario, there doesn't seem to be a real, any kind of substantial or significant decrease in grass production even to the end of the century, or maybe some happening at the end of the century. However, if you're in the hot and dry climate scenario, which is represented by the MyRock, there could be a substantial decrease in time, or particularly in the latter half of the century. And then we are also very interested in the role of fire, because as the park is at the prairie forest border, and there's a lot of information to show that fire has been a very important factor in determining where that boundary is. We did a lot of work to calibrate the model so that it represented fire conditions here at Wind Cave as well as we could. And basically the results from this calibration showed that suppression of all fires would basically, despite the warming, despite drying, there could still be substantial expansion of ponderosa pine trees into the grasslands at Wind Cave. So these blobs are the outline of the park, and purple represents low tree biomass or no tree biomass, meaning that it's grassland. red is high tree biomass, green is somewhere in between. So you can see these squares that aren't purple anymore represent woody encroachment. However, if you have a prescribed fire program, that doesn't happen. So, based on our findings at Wing Cave, which you see the location of here now in case you didn't know where it was, we saw the call for the RFP for proposals and thought, well, we think we've done a good job with this fire modeling at Wing Cave. We wonder now what if those results or if that calibration can help us understand what might be happening in the a greater domain, which we show here in the colored areas of the northern Great Plains area that we plan to cover in the project funded by the Climate Science Center. Now, I realize that woody encroachment in the northern Great Plains might not have even made your top list of 27 things to tack with research. But there were a few reasons that we focus on this potential stressor. First of all, there's a variety of literature that suggests that grassland specialist species, things such as grassland birds, don't do well when there's woody encroachment into the grasslands. And there is evidence that woody encroachment is a serious issue in areas that basically border the northern Great Plains area. Compared to some other regions, the central Great Plains showed the highest increase in woody cover. And that's central meaning a north-south axis rather than east-west. They didn't even measure it in northern Great Plains because there wasn't enough data. And finally, climate change doesn't involve just changing temperature and precipitation. It's all driven, of course, by carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide has effects on plant growth independent of temperature and precipitation. And one of those effects may be making the region more conducive to tree growth because of its effects on water use efficiency by the plants. So we basically plan on working with NC1 for that region shown in this slide here. We hope to incorporate some different climate projection data, some that are perhaps more refined because they're regional models, as opposed to just statistical downscaling from the global climate models. The regional models take a lot more, or look at the topography of the region in a lot more detail, and therefore can really refine projections for different areas affected by mountains or various things. We hope to improve the model in a variety of ways, including how you calculate potential evapotranspiration. And that's important because if it's wrong, you could be under or overestimating drought stress, which of course is important to tree growth in the plains. One thing that we might address, if it seems reasonable for this region, is to try to come up with some way to incorporate insect attacks on trees, because that can have a significant effect on the distribution of trees at the prairie forest border. And then, of course, there's a lot of things that we'll need to do to expand the model that we've calibrated for Wing Cave to the larger northern Great Plains region. And the way that we do that is to compare the output from the model for the basically contemporary period with vegetation maps, and if they exist, for carbon stock records, because the model really works in terms of carbon. If there are stream gauge data, the model has a hydrological component to it that we want to make sure is reasonable. And also, of course, with getting the fire return interval relevant to the period or to the region that we're working in. And a lot of that, or ideally a lot of that would come from published papers, but we realize that a lot of it might also come from expert advice from folks like you and others that you might know. And then we also, of course, want to run this using reasonably realistic management scenarios in terms of how frequent a prescribed fire might be happening on refuges and other land in the area, both public and private, what type of grazing levels there are. And then, of course, also tailor the output to your needs. You saw some examples of the types of things we thought were relevant to management at Wing Cave National Park, and I think a lot of them will be also relevant to the larger area, and I hope to other management agencies. So, for example, down in the right-hand corner of this slide, we show the number of days per year that basically an index of fire danger is exceeded. And in the historical period, it's on the order of 30 or something like that, whereas in the future climate runs, we're seeing one of them getting up to more than 80 days per year by the end of the century. Is that type of information something that you would be interested in? And we could also, or I don't know, if we ever get to a carbon economy, if you're going to have to account for your carbon fluxes, is that something that you'd be interested in? And then we can also investigate uncertainties about the future. How much of a CO2 effect is there? The climate projections are notoriously bad at projecting precipitation. Would you want us to vary that somewhat to see if how big of an effect that's having on the future vegetation of the region? So with that, I'll just end with giving you my contact information on this slide in case you have questions, concerns, ideas beyond today. I will probably be contacting you for further input, hopefully. But right now, please fire away with questions.
Thank you again, Amy, for the presentation. This is Mike. The one question that jumps out at me is you showed a slide early on that shows an increased growth in grasses earlier in the year, and then it tapers off below some historical averages. I wonder if there is a temporal aspect or a temporal change in the subsequent fire regime that you might expect with that change in mean monthly grass growth.
Right. That's a good question. The fire module in MC1 is not perfect when it comes to simulating what really happens on the ground because of limitations. And what it does basically is it sets a fire as soon as the biomass, just the fuel loads and the fuel moisture conditions make it possible for a fire. So that's not so it seems like it would be able to pick up a change in seasonality. We honestly didn't look at that for this project, but it does seem like something that we could.
Thanks. But maybe if there's an overriding humidity aspect to that it could dampen any sort of a change.
Right, yeah.
Additional questions for Amy?
Yeah, Amy, this is Rick. Kind of along those same lines, has anybody thought about trying to get a handle, and I don't even know if you can do this, but fire frequency is one aspect, but what about fire behavior? Anybody thinking about changes in fire behavior that may come about because of not just increased frequency, but if it's drier, some of those things, we might see hotter fires, like we're seeing some of the forest fires out west this year.
Yeah, and the fire module of MC1 does simulate fire behavior. basically how much mortality there is based on the how much of it is crown fire versus just an under a ground fire, basically. And so it does get at that. Again, it's not perfect because of some assumptions that have to be made about wind speed, which is a huge driver of fire intensity. And because of that, you can make some statements about fire intensity, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. But it does simulate, fuel moistures, and if those are changing, then you can extrapolate that using your own knowledge about fires for the future.
Thanks. What about, Amy, something that we didn't anticipate in northwest North Dakota 10 years ago, the huge increase in number of people moving to a region, and folks like to live around trees. Is there anything that we can use from expected population growth for this area, and what that might mean to trees out on the prairie?
Well, right now MC1 is designed to simulate potential natural vegetation, and that includes, so basically it will say whether or not trees are expected to be able to survive and grow there, and if you turn off the fire completely, you could then simulate perchance the possibility of trees, or how much effort it would take to get trees to grow in this area, escaping from planted areas around developed areas. Right now, Dominique is actually working on another project that will dovetail nicely with this one, that tries to incorporate land use change into the model. And I think that will, people's effects not only on fragmentation, but what they actually do to the vegetation is going to be a big part of that.
Great, thanks.
Hey, Amy, this is Max. I have a question for you. Can you page ahead to that slide, that one right there? So this is showing the results from different grazing strategies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, are these strategies that are realistic for Wind Cave?
One of the things that we hope to do with this project is to improve the realism of the grazing equation, you might call it, in MC1, because right now it's a constant removal of production, whereas in some areas it makes more sense that you would say that you remove a certain amount of biomass a year.
Sure.
Because you have a certain number of animals and you have to keep them alive. So that's one thing that we started talking about with Wind Cave. The way the model is constructed now, you'd have to do some kind of like circular calculations to do the biomass removal, but it is something that we do want to try to improve. And the removal rates as they are now, just ignoring that biomass versus production one, 25 and 50% removal are realistic. 70% removal throughout the whole park is not. But there are areas where 70% removal does occur because of prairie dogs.
Right.
Or it might occur in certain years when it's dry and you can't reduce your herd size.
So if you were going to try to interpret this then for a manager in terms of coming up with a good foraging strategy over time, what would you say based on these results? I guess my question is, it doesn't look like to me like the management, at least at the 25 and 50% removal, doesn't really seem to do much.
Right, and that's.
Or they don't. I shouldn't say they don't.
They don't, and that's. I don't have the curves. That's honestly a large part or a large reason for that is because from the best information that we could find, 25 and 50% grazing or removal every year is not sufficient. Doesn't damage the growth of plants sufficiently, or to basically, or let's say, it doesn't reduce their vitality enough to reduce their growth in the following growing season. So they're able to compensate for that much removal in the 25 and 50% removal rates. Once you get down to 70%, which is considered pretty heavy grazing, then, as most ranchers would be able to tell you, you don't want to do that because that's going to affect your future production.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. This is Audrey.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, is there a minimum total acreage for which this model is accurate?
So at Wind Cave, we were running on a pretty fine scale. The model takes in not only climate information but also soils information based on the NRCS Sergo database, which are basically soils maps for the whole United States. And that we had data for Wind Cave at the approximately 800 by 800 meter grid cell size. For a larger region like the Northern Great Plains, we're planning on running more at something like the 4-kilometer grid cell size. Saying that a grid cell is 800 meters basically says that all of the soils, or the soils are homogeneous within that cell, which of course is not true for especially a heterogeneous area like Wind Cave. So you got to keep that in mind, that we're not trying to say what's going to happen at this exact point, at this exact time, but it's showing general trends and differences between different soil types and different climates.
Okay, thank you.
We've got time for maybe one more question. All right. Maybe we don't have one more left for you, Amy, but thank you again for providing the update on the project. I think folks are really looking forward to seeing it progress. And you mentioned that one of the things you really are looking for is some feedback on this, and you'll be contacting some of the members of the tech team, I assume, or could provide you that direct feedback. We can share your contact information with folks again, and we'll, like I said earlier, we'll have a copy of this presentation on our website shortly, so folks who were not able to attend today can watch it as well.
Okay. Yeah. Just stay tuned for more questions that I'll have for you folks.
Any last words, Rick or Max?
No, just thanks to Max and Amy, and thanks to those of you who were able to call in and participate today.
All right. Thank you, folks. We'll talk again in about a month.
Thank you.